This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is from our Protecting Animals series where we talk to animal advocates past and present about the work they do for animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now I talk about ASA every week. You might even be getting bored of hearing about ASA. If you're getting bored, you should become a member, and then once every single person in the whole world is a member, I can stop advertising them. Now, in addition to lots of other wonderful things they do, ASA also works very closely on the Animal Studies Journal, which is coming out of the University of Wollongong. It's got a lot of really fabulous publications about animal studies. So check out ASA and check out the Animal Studies Journal. Now, this episode is also brought to you by Animal Publics. Animal Publics is another wonderful place where animal studies scholars publish. Are you detecting a theme here? Animal Publics is part of the University of Sydney Press. So the University of Sydney is doing really, really wonderful work bringing the good news of animal studies to the world in book form. So go to the University of Sydney's website and have a look at the Animal Publics section where you'll find a lot of really wonderful books by prominent animal studies scholars. Okay, let's get down to business. Well, we're here in Sydney town. The sun is shining. It's a beautiful, beautiful day. We're really in the heart of power. I'm feeling the weight of power. We're actually at Macquarie Street, and more than just Macquarie Street, I'm actually at New South Wales Parliament House. So this week I'm really, really lucky to be joined by the Honourable Emma Hurst MLC. Now, Emma sits in the Parliament of New South Wales in the upper house, which is actually called the Council, but some people refer to it as the Senate. It's like the Senate, but it's not called the Senate, but it functions like the Senate in our federal system. And Emma represents the Animal Justice Party. And so today we're going to have a chat to her about lots of aspects of her life working for animals, including her work for animals in Parliament. Welcome to the podcast, Emma.
Hello.
Okay, Emma, let's take a few steps back before we find out how you got to be in this wonderful building and working for animals in Parliament. Why did you get involved in animal advocacy in the first place?
I recall my first memory of really connecting with the idea of animal sentience probably when I was about 8 years old. I was at one of those awful petting zoos. I think I was at something like that. And I was holding this hen and I was patting her, and it suddenly occurred to me that this hen was purring and was showing joy and contentment and pleasure in me patting her in the same way as my rescue cat at home did. And I went home and I wrote a note to my parents that said, I don't want to eat animals anymore. I want to go vegetarian. So my parents weren't big meat eaters, but they always struggled to get me to eat meat growing up because I had made that connection. However, it was many years later that I was just walking down the street one day and somebody handed me a flyer with information in regards to animal rights. And I looked it up on the web and spent all night just reading through the Animal Liberation website, PETA websites, everything overseas, watching every video that I could find. And I realized that, I was a vegetarian because I didn't want to kill animals, but I had no idea what was happening in the dairy industry, what was happening in the egg industry, and the real nature of death and cruelty within the entire industry. And I went vegan overnight. And I was at starting university and I was studying education, and I realised that I didn't want to be a teacher. I wanted to work in animal advocacy. So I switched to psychology. And my basis for that was that I felt that human cruelty is a human-caused issue. So therefore, the solution has to be human-based as well. And a lot of that would come down to people changing their behaviour when, and it's not even so much people changing their behaviour as to how they would treat an animal in a slaughterhouse in regards to welfare, but changing our behaviour because people do care about animals, but so many of us are harming animals on a day-to-day basis just through our habits, by what we choose to buy at the supermarket, what we choose to wear, what we choose to do on our weekends or holidays, swimming with dolphins, for example. And we're causing great harm to animals quite often without even knowing it.
Right. Well, Emma, I feel like my first memory of you is perhaps in the noughties, maybe early noughties. Yeah. So Animal Liberation New South Wales had monthly meetings in Sydney, and we'd often go to a now closed and very much missed vegetarian restaurant in the centre of town after the meetings. And I can remember chatting to you after one of the meetings at a restaurant. So my sense is that you started by getting involved as a volunteer or coming to the meetings. Can you say something about your journey from someone who was alive to the issues to someone who was actively involved and who, I guess, found a place or a role for themselves within the animal protection movement?
Yeah, so I went vegan, and I didn't really know any other vegans. And I was one of those people, when I first went vegan, I thought, once I start explaining to people what's going on, then everyone around me is going to go vegan, which unfortunately didn't happen. And so that's when I started to realise that I wanted to get more and more involved in animal advocacy. And I first reached out to Animal Liberation. I was quite shy, so I was a little bit nervous to go off on my own and join a group of people and go to these dinners with a bunch of strangers, essentially. So I joined the Animal Liberation email list, and I was watching all the things that was happening. And I can't remember if I went to this event before I went to a meeting, but it was either around the same time or very close to it. But one email came through, and I was with my boyfriend at the time, whose parents lived in Canberra, and the event was in Canberra to go in and try to stop this shooting of the kangaroos in the park there at night. And so I said to him, let's go to Canberra, it's on tonight. This was one of the emails that came through from Animal Lib. And so he said, okay, sure, we'll go stay at my parents' place. So we packed up and went off to Canberra with this big plan of jumping into the area where they were going to shoot these kangaroos. And I met a couple of guys there that were from Animal Liberation ACT, and we went in, and it was the first night that they actually found the actual hunters and approached them as well. And the hunters came after us with their trucks. I was trying to take photos, and they ran us off the road. And when the police came, there was this whole big sort of kerfuffle about, whether or not it was okay that they hit me with their car because we were trespassing. And, eventually we just said, look, there's more people in there. There wasn't, but we said that there was so that they would have to call off the hunt for that night. But that was probably one of my first experiences. And then I think when I started to go to some of the Animal Liberation meetings on Castlereagh Street, that was kind of, like a talking point as well, to sort of be part of that movement and things and changes that were happening.
So I was someone who went to the meetings and was one of the people that helped organise them. And then at some point I left and moved down to Melbourne and lived there for a very long time. And so I guess my perspective on your journey is very distant. I might run into you every few years at an event, but my sense is that you started working on more and more campaigns and then became employed in animal protection organisations. Can you tell us something about the work you did in those years and how you became, I guess, maybe what we might call a professional in the area?
Yeah, so I ended up I actually started off, the first parts of work that I did, I ran an animal club because I was running a after-school care centre while I was still going through university. So I wanted to still be doing animal work, and so I had this wonderful group of little animal advocates, and we used to do all sorts of arts and crafts and various different things. I actually have a very strong memory of showing my animal club a video that was approved for school children that showed them the very basics of farming systems, and it showed them the caged system for in the egg industry. And I remember it really strongly because I remember this young boy, and he was in year 1, so I think he must have been about 7 years old. And he turned and he just looked at me and he was absolutely fuming. He was shaking with anger, and he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "When we are adults," and he pointed at the screen, he said, "we will not be doing this." And I think that really... I remembered that moment when I got elected here into Parliament, because I realised he would be an adult now, and we've still got 12 million hens in cages right across Australia. But it was just interesting to see, that child innocence and the way that children really respect and connect to animals as quite a natural process. But then, as I was doing my master's, I got a job at Animal Liberation. In New South Wales, I was just continually volunteering. And so when a position became available, I took on a part-time position. So I was able to still run my animal club and then also work for Animal Lib. And continued through to my master's in health psychology. And I would often work, for many years, I worked part-time at Animal Liberation while having other part-time working as a psychologist at University of Western Sydney, working in a psychiatric unit out in Kellyville. And I guess that sort of helped me build a variety of skills. And I was constantly trying to upskill myself throughout that process as well. So I put myself through NIDA. I also put myself for media, not acting, sorry. And I also put myself through a program called Australian Progress, which is actually a fellowship course, which is quite intensive, but it's about change makers and teaching people how to run campaigns, to do social media and media. There's a lot of human rights and environmental activists in these courses. And I thought we need to learn from these movements that are, 10 steps further down the road. I also did a tour through the US where I met with a whole lot of progressive movements there to try and understand what tactics that they used and what worked. And did a whole lot of research and used my psych research skills while I was at Animal Liberation. I moved on from Animal Liberation after about 10 years as the campaign director there, and got a job with People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, where I worked entirely on media, which was one area which I hadn't done as much of at Animal Liberation. And really learned a lot about messaging and how to sort of get the animal story out there through my work with Peter. And then I worked for World Animal Protection International, which really utilised some of my psychology skills because I was working in a campaign mobilisation role, which really is looking at strategy, so working on focus groups and research to work out what the barriers to change are for people, and then designing campaigns around that research to help pull apart those barriers, and also to encourage behaviour change. And that was really worldwide. I was working a lot in China, India, and the UK as well. So that kind of really built a really strong skill set, so that when Mark Pearson, who is my former colleague at Animal Liberation, who was the first member of Parliament elected to the Animal Justice Party, said, would you consider running? I guess for me, I thought, well, where am I best placed for animals? And I can see the fantastic work that organisations are doing on behaviour change, getting people to change their own personal behaviours, but also corporate change. I need to look at Animals Australia and a lot of their campaigns, getting corporations to make commitments to phase out caged eggs by 2025, for example. That I could see so much progress in those areas. But the third area of progress, and I think that we need progress in all three, so individual change, corporate change, and then legislative change is the third one. And our parliaments are just so far behind. We are so far behind legislating to protect animals that I thought, this is where I need to be to start, I guess, from the very bottom of the hill here. But, it's the area where we need the greatest change to catch up with where society is and what society expects us to do in regards to animal protection.
So it was a bit touch and go, your election. I was feeling very nervous. Can you tell us something about that process of campaigning and then what it feels like as the votes are being counted and then recounted? And it must have been nerve-wracking.
It was, the actual election was really interesting. I had a great team and people were so focused and putting in so many hours of work that you really had to sort of, pull up your bootstraps and really go for it. And we figured, we may as well go for it. And it was really interesting for me because I really involved myself in a lot of the process of it. I wasn't just going to events and speaking and going wherever I was thrown. I actually looked through all the materials and changed the messaging based on what I had been taught, even as far as changing all the flyers. So instead of saying we want to end this or get rid of this and stop this, it was no, if I get elected, what will we do? What will we achieve? So what will a vote actually get people in return? So remessaging, but also, going out day to day, handing out flyers to people on the street, which was really tiring and really confronting. And the day of the election, I didn't eat. I started at about 4 a.m. We were putting up placards at places where we couldn't get anybody because there's so many election booths, we didn't have enough volunteers. So we found somewhere we wouldn't have people and put up placards. And then I had my team here in Sydney CBD and just didn't stop all day. And then there was an after party, which was, I was just absolutely exhausted by the time I got to this after party, and everybody was very depressed because we could see that we were going to end up with another Liberal national government. And we knew that this after party we weren't going to know where we sat because we knew that that would be one of the last seats if we got it. But everybody kind of left quite deflated. And I remember getting out of the car and walking back to my apartment, and I was so exhausted that I had to lean up against the wall, and I'm walking myself along this wall. I've never been this exhausted in my life. And this couple walked past, and one of them said, "Oh my gosh, that woman is so drunk." And I hadn't had anything to drink. I was just so physically exhausted that I couldn't walk properly. So that was a nice low for the election campaign. But then there was this awful limbo, don't know where to go. And the only thing we could do was remain hopeful. And every time we saw projections saying that there's an outside chance that AGP might get elected, we're like, okay, so that's not a no. That's not a no. And it was interesting because you'd hear from somebody, one of the, like the vote whisperers, the people who look at all the numbers, rang one of our members on the board of directors and said, "Oh, she's in. I'm looking at the vote preferences and where it's all going to fall, and you're definitely going to get in." And so we'd all get excited, and then somebody would say, "Oh gosh, no, there's no chance. You do realise that you're way off," and then everyone would have a low. And so it was a real roller coaster ride, and I really had to try and disengage from it because there's nothing you can do. So it was really having to just let go and wait. But on the actual day, I felt oddly confident, and it just dragged out. We just sat there talking, and as the names popped up on the screen, because we were saying there's an outside chance we'll get the last seat. And then Michael, one of our board of directors, was sitting next to me, and he said, "Oh, congratulations, you're in." And I looked up and I said, "No, that says Rod Roberts." I said, "That's One Nation." And he goes, No, you're not last. You're second last." We said, "Oh my goodness," because I was looking at the bottom one. It was so, yes, we were all very excited. And it was
wonderful.
Yeah.
So then you win a seat in Parliament, which is where laws are made, and it's the apex of our democratic system. So you arrive here. What's it like being in Parliament?
It's really interesting. Look, I need to be realistic. That's, sometimes I need to step back, and I want to sort of create these enormous changes, and sometimes I need to step back and realise that it may just always be lighting a candle in a very, very dark place and being the voice for animals in Parliament. And I think what's interesting is you can reach people on a personal level, and a lot of MPs I've had a lot of conversations with, or they've heard my speeches and they've looked at me, and you can see them starting to think, I think she's got a point, or she's right about this. But then they toe party line and they do what they're told. So it's kind of, and I knew coming in that it was going to be very frustrating. And then sometimes out of the blue, it just seems very hopeful. And you think, well, maybe if we can do this, or maybe if we can do that. And I realise, that there's multiple parts of me being elected, and a lot of that's not to do with actually getting legislation passed, which is always going to be hard for a minor party. The Greens have never passed a piece of legislation, I don't think. But it's about pushing those boundaries. It's about getting the questions to the government, putting them on notice, asking them in budget estimates what they're doing about these issues. And what we've noticed, and something that Mark and I have discussed quite a bit, is it's almost as though most of Parliament now is about animals. And so last week and in our next sitting week, it's all about, we did a disallowance motion on the biosecurity regulations, which were ag-gag regulations. We debated the right to farm bill. We put up a notice of motion, which we ended up passing for an investigation into the horse racing industry after the 7:30 report. So that was all debated. And so it's almost like the animal issues have become front and centre and a main focus within Parliament, which it probably wouldn't have otherwise. We've got inquiries up on battery-caged eggs, on the Protection of Cruelty to Animals Act enforcement, on the use of animals in circuses and dolphins in dolphinariums. So there's just, and koalas as well, the protection of koalas. So there's just so much happening. And it really hit home when we were doing the healthcare reform bill, which was the abortion bill to decriminalise abortion, when the shooters, fishers and farmers got up to speak to the bill and started talking and whinging about how much work we were all doing on animals instead of issues like that. And I thought, why would you make your speech about the Animal Justice Party and all the work that we're getting up and getting involved in stuff? And then like a very hard right liberal got up and gave the same speech. And then Barnaby Joyce started talking about it. And it was just all sort of odd. And then I thought, we've really got their attention. They're obviously very nervous about how much we're getting up and what the discussion point is. And that we've really got a strong control of the narrative around what legislative changes are needed. So I think that we're really going in leaps and bounds, even though sometimes it doesn't feel like it, we are.
So for people listening to this episode who are thinking to themselves, wow, what a wonderful story, how can I help? How can I either be like Emma, or how can I help Emma or help people like her? What's your advice? How do people get involved?
The Animal Justice Party has regional groups, mostly throughout most of New South Wales. I think that there might be some in other states and territories as well. So I would always suggest getting involved there first, so contacting the state office, depending on where people live in Australia. And getting involved. You've got to sort of, put your head out first. And in the same way that I did many, many years ago at Animal Liberation, going out and attending a meeting on my own, even if I felt nervous. If that's what you want to do, then you need to get involved and start those conversations and get to know other people that are in this space. That's always going to be a first step. And a lot of these regional groups are running their own campaigns. So our Coffs Harbour regional group is running a campaign on the use of dolphins in captivity and entertainment, because that's where our last dolphinarium is. Our Wollongong group is running a really strong campaign on the use of animals in circuses. And if you're really keen, we've got council elections coming up next year. So our next priority as the Animal Justice Party is to get people onto those councils. So if you wanted to potentially work in this area, then we're looking for fantastic candidates that could put their hand up. And there's so much that can be done on a council level, particularly around the use of animals in pounds, laws around that, around puppy farming as well. So, we really need people to put their hands up and to get involved.
Wow, imagine sitting on the local government. Imagine being mayor such and such for the Animal Justice Party. And that's, of course, how the Greens got their start. So, Emma, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sounds good.
Now, you might have already said a little bit about this, but you might have more to say. Can you recall when you first started to think that there was something wrong or problematic about the relationship between human and non-human animals?
I think it was when I first became vegan, and I had the idea in my head that if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everybody would be vegetarian or vegan. And the day that I really clicked was when I realised that it's not that simple. I showed people Earthlings and various other documentaries, and they'd cry and they'd get very angry and very upset and ask me what they could do, and next week they sat down and ate a steak. And it was very frustrating, and I think that that's a leading cause of burnout for people. So it was the day I realised that it's more complex than that, and that I've got to chip away at certain different areas to try to get to that same goal.
That's right. I mean, the people who work in slaughterhouses aren't vegetarian and vegan. So
exactly.
As a matter of fact, that is incorrect. Thank you, Paul McCartney.
We love you, Paul. We still love you.
Must try harder. Can you recall the first thing you did to try and bring about change for animals?
Look, it probably goes back to that animal club group. That was the first thing that I really took on as an ownership. And because I was running the after school care centre at the time, when I came in, can you imagine they were eating for afternoon tea, they were being given pasta with mince meat and cheese for afternoon tea. So I got rid of that and made the whole thing vegan, and the children were actually really happy. So we had these big fruit platters and Vegemite on crackers and things like that. So the entire thing became vegan, and then just running that animal club. I registered with Voiceless as well, my animal club, and ran it through them as well. So that was the first project I really worked on.
Wonderful. If you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I would have to say Jeffrey Mason. I don't actually know him personally, but when I first became involved in animal advocacy, I think it was his books. I just grabbed every book I could and tried to read everything I could. So I read Peter Singer's book and various other ones. But I think that Jeffrey's book, The Pig That Sang to the Moon and When Elephants Weep, they just had this real connection, and they made a lot of sense in regards to animal sentience and animal conscience, and the ability for animals to feel pain and the ability for animals to suffer. And it really gave the story of animals, and I think that was really important to my growth in becoming an advocate.
Well, shout out to Jeffrey, past guest of the podcast. What's the most important thing animal advocates can do for animals?
I think just make sure that we include their stories. I mean, we've got so many ag-gag laws coming out and threats from government to try to silence and reduce transparency, but they can't silence our voices. They can't silence the truth. And we all know what happens to animals behind closed doors, and I think that we need to tell their stories. We need to tell people about the hen that was avoided maceration because she was female, and then had the front of her face burnt off and then put into a cage for 16 months where she didn't even have the ability to turn around. We need to tell that story to people because it does shock and horrify people, but we need to tell her story. We need to tell the story of, the calf in the dairy industry that was born male and taken from his mother, and the story of the mothers that cry throughout the night. And anybody that's stayed anywhere near a dairy farm can tell horrific stories of hearing the cows crying through the night when their calves have been taken. But we need to remind people of those stories and to use those stories because they're very, very powerful.
Indeed. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think just that recognition of sentience. It was really heartwarming to see the ACT recently pass legislation on animal sentience. And I mean, that's where it all boils down. It's that recognition that animals have the same or similar ability to feel pain and to feel and to suffer and to feel fear, for example. And there's this divide between a lot of people can recognize it for cats and dogs, and we don't extend that beyond certain species. And just to start to pull some of those barriers down and to get through some of that cognitive dissonance to recognize the sentience of all creatures.
Wonderful. Well, Emma, this is probably a very big question for someone such as yourself, but what are you working on next?
We've been working on the battery cage hen issue, and that's going to be an ongoing piece of work as that goes on through next year before there's any kind of national decision made in regards to a phase out of the use of cages in the egg industry. We are also working on puppy farms. We've seen some really good legislative changes in Queensland and Victoria. And unfortunately, what that means is a lot of puppy farmers are crossing the border and setting up shop in New South Wales. So we probably need to jump on top of that and get some changes in that particular space. We've got the inquiry that is currently underway on the use of animals in entertainment, so that will be another big project that we'll be working on towards the end of this year and early next year.
Wonderful. So how can people find out more about your work?
So we can, if you hop on to the New South Wales Animal Justice Party website, I've also got my own website, which I can't recall off the top of my head, but I think it's emmahurstmp.com or something like that. I've also got an e-subscriber, so if you find the website and you can get onto the email list, we often email people our updates and big news that's happening or action points when we need people to email MPs on particular issues and when we've got inquiries up around animal issues. I've also got my Facebook page, which I regularly update, and I often do weekly summary videos as well to let people know exactly what we're working on in Parliament, just so people realise what work is going in and going on for animals, and to have that sort of open transparency, so that people who gave us their vote will know what they actually voted for and the work that's going on behind that.
Wonderful. Well, Emma, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars and animal advocates about the work they do for animals. And you can also find us on the internet. We're on Twitter at knowing_animals. We're at Facebook at Knowing Animals. We also have an Instagram page. And don't forget to leave a review at iTunes, because reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like Knowing Animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.